Hello friends, welcome into Deep Dive Secrets. On the outside, the marriage of Lila Hartwell and Evan Crossridge looked like something pulled straight from a glossy lifestyle magazine white-columned. Colonial home in the quiet suburbs of Westfield, New Jersey, curated family photos on social media, polite dinner parties with neighbors who admired their calm chemistry, and a reputation for being the stable ones among friends whose own relationships were far messier but perfection, when examined closely, often functions less like truth and more like camouflage. And tonight's story begins with a single, almost forgettable moment that cracked that illusion wide open when Lila, a 42-year-old interior stylist known for restoring old homes into warm, livable spaces, discovered a second phone hidden inside a hollowed-out hardcover book on Evan's office shelf. A book titled The Architecture of Trust that he had never once mentioned reading. It was late, nearly midnight, rain tapping softly against the windows, and Davina, 45-year-old logistics consultant who traveled frequently for client strategy meetings, was asleep upstairs, breathing evenly, unaware that the life he had carefully constructed was about to be questioned for the first time in 17 years of marriage. And what made the moment unsettling wasn't just the secrecy of the device, but the fact that Lila hadn't been looking for anything at all, only searching for a warranty receipt after their dishwasher flooded the kitchen earlier that evening. The kind of mundane domestic problem that usually reinforced their teamwork rather than strained it. The phone was unlocked, no password, as if Evan never expected anyone else to touch it. And the screen lit up with a message preview from a contact saved simply as M. Reading, same time next week. You promised. And in that instant, Lila's mind did what it had always done, contextualize, rationalize, telling herself there had to be a reasonable explanation, a business project, a confidential client, maybe even a surprise she wasn't meant to see. Because their marriage, as everyone knew, didn't have cracks like this, except that the longer she stood there in the quiet office, the more she realized how carefully Evan had trained her and everyone else not to look too closely. To understand how they reached this moment, you have to rewind years earlier to when Lila first met Evan at a charity fundraiser in Princeton, where he was charming without being flashy, attentive without being intrusive, a man who listened in a way that made people feel briefly extraordinary. And she, recently relocated from Oregon after ending a long-term relationship, saw in him a sense of grounded reliability she desperately wanted. And they built their relationship the way responsible adults do, intentionally, with shared calendars, financial transparency, and mutual respect, marrying after 3 years, welcoming their daughter Naomi Crossridge into the world 2 years later, and settling into a rhythm that outsiders often mistook for passion when it was really discipline, routine, and a shared belief that love was something you maintained rather than felt. Evan handled investments and long-term planning. Lila managed the emotional labor of family life, school schedules, social obligations, and the subtle work of making their home feel alive. And for a long time, this division worked so seamlessly that neither questioned what might be missing beneath the surface, especially since Evan's frequent travel offered a convenient explanation for emotional distance, exhaustion, or his habit of taking late-night walks alone when he returned home. Habits Lila chalked up to stress rather than secrecy, but perfection has a cost. And in their case, the cost was curiosity. Because when nothing appears wrong, you stop asking questions. And Lila had stopped asking questions years ago, trusting that transparency was no longer necessary when consistency had already been proven, a belief reinforced by friends like Marisol Vega, Lila's closest confidant, and a family law paralegal who often joked that Lila had won the marriage lottery, and neighbors like Grant Holloway, who admired Evan's calm demeanor and once asked him for advice on managing conflict without drama. What none of them saw was how Evan's calm functioned as insulation, how he avoided confrontation not by resolving it but by redirecting attention, how he framed disagreements as inefficiencies to be managed rather than emotional realities to be addressed, and how this same skill set that made him successful in his career also allowed him to compartmentalize parts of his life with surgical precision. As Lila stared at the phone, she noticed the calendar app synced only with Evan's travel schedule, blocked out hours labeled with neutral placeholders like review or offline. And though she didn't scroll further, fear, not morality, stopped her. She felt a shift inside herself, A subtle but irreversible awareness that the marriage she thought she understood might be only the version Evan had curated for public consumption, and the most unsettling realization of all was not anger or betrayal but doubt, because doubt corrodes certainty quietly, making every past memory suddenly negotiable, every affectionate gesture potentially strategic. And as Lila placed the phone back exactly where she found it, aligning the book's spine perfectly with the others, she understood that whatever Evan was hiding had survived precisely because their marriage appeared flawless. Because no one questions a structure that looks sound. And this was the moment to true, beginning when the hidden life behind a perfect marriage started demanding to be seen. The days following that discovery unfolded with an unsettling normalcy that made Lila question her own perception, because Evan Crossridge remained exactly as he always had, attentive in public, efficient in conversation, gently affectionate in ways that never demanded too much, and if guilt lived in him, it was buried deep enough not to surface in the small rituals of daily life, like brewing her preferred dark roast in the morning or reminding Naomi Crossridge to pack her violin for after-school rehearsal. And yet Lila began to notice how much of their shared life operated on Evan's terms, how his version of transparency had always been selective, framed as professionalism or privacy rather than secrecy. And this awareness sharpened her senses in ways she hadn't anticipated, causing her to register details she once filtered out. The way Evan angled his laptop screen slightly away from her at the kitchen island. The way his phone vibrated silently rather than audibly. The way he sometimes stepped into the garage to take calls even when it was freezing outside. She didn't confront him, not yet, because confrontation implied certainty. And what she had was suspicion layered over years of trust. A dangerous combination that left her oscillating between resolve and self-doubt. And instead she did what she always did when life became unstable. She observed, cataloged, and waited. During this period, Evan announced another upcoming trip, this time to Denver, claiming it involved a supply chain restructuring project with a Midwestern distribution firm, a plausible explanation that fit neatly into his professional narrative. Except that Lila noticed the trip wasn't on their shared digital calendar, a subtle deviation that set her nerves humming. And when she casually asked about the dates, Evan answered smoothly, almost too smoothly, as if rehearsed, assuring her it was tentative and subject to change, a phrase he rarely used because he disliked uncertainty. Lila mentioned the trip to Marisol Vega over coffee at a small cafe in downtown Westfield, framing it lightly, testing the idea aloud without revealing the phone. But Marisol's response unsettled her more than she expected, because instead of dismissing the concern, Marisol paused and asked, "Has Evan ever given you a reason not to trust him?" And when Lila said no, Marisol nodded slowly and replied, "That's not always the same thing as giving you a reason to trust him." A statement shaped by Marisol's years of observing marriages, unravel not from explosive betrayal but from quiet omissions that eventually hollowed out the core. Meanwhile, Naomi, 13, and perceptive in the way adolescents often are when adults underestimate them, began asking questions too, not about the marriage but about Evan's absences. How he forgot small promises like helping her with a science project or attending her chamber recital. Details Evan would later compensate for with gifts or apologies that felt transactional rather than sincere. And Lila felt an acute sense of guilt, realizing how long she had accepted these patterns as normal. How she had framed emotional distance as maturity rather than neglect. The more she observed, the clearer it became that Evan's life operated in compartments, each sealed off from the others. And the phone was merely one artifact of a broader system of control. One he maintained through predictability and an image of reliability that discouraged scrutiny. And this realization pushed Lila to the confrontation Lila Hartwell once imagined as explosive arrived instead as a slow, grinding pressure that made every interaction with Evan Crossridge feel weighted, deliberate, and performative. Because now that she had evidence, quiet, verifiable proof rather than intuition, she could no longer unsee the mechanics of his deception. And what unsettled her most was not the existence of another life, but the discipline with which Evan protected it, adjusting his behavior just enough to avoid detection while maintaining the appearance of marital harmony. After overhearing that late-night call, Lila said nothing immediately, choosing instead to watch how Evan responded to the possibility of exposure. And she noticed how the next morning he was unusually attentive, offering to drive Naomi Crossridge to school, suggesting a weekend getaway, just the two of them, and casually mentioning how grateful he was for their stability. Gestures that would once have reassured her but now read as containment strategies. not affection. And it became clear that Evan's instinct when threatened was not confession, but recalibration. Lila met again with Reed Callahan, this time with fewer hedges and more urgency, explaining what she had overheard and authorizing him to continue. And Reed's findings came back methodically, revealing that the Savannah trip was not an anomaly, but part of a recurring pattern. That Evan had been traveling under the guise of business to a handful of secondary city Charleston, Nashville locations chosen not for convenience, but for discretion. And that in each place, he stayed at the same boutique hotels, always for 2 nights, always midweek, and always aligning with the same calendar blocks, labeled ambiguously as offline. And while Reed could not legally identify who Evan met without crossing ethical lines, the pattern itself suggested intentional continuity rather than opportunistic behavior. A parallel routine as structured as Evan's professional life. Armed with this knowledge, Lila began preparing not just emotionally, but strategically, consulting Maricel Vega, not as a friend, but as a legal professional, asking hypotheticals about asset protection, custody, considerations, and the risks of confronting a spouse who values control above transparency. And Marisol's responses were cautious, emphasizing documentation, timing, and emotional safety, reminding Lila that exposure does not always produce accountability, especially when the person exposed believes their actions are justified. The breaking point came sooner than Lila expected, triggered not by infidelity itself, but by Evan's attempt to enlist Naomi unknowingly into his compartmentalized life. When he asked her daughter to lie about a school obligation so he could miss a family dinner without explanation, framing it as a harmless favor. And Naomi, uncomfortable but eager to please, mentioned it to Lila afterward with confusion rather than secrecy. And something inside Lila snapped not into rage but into clarity, because Evan had crossed from private deception into ethical trespass, teaching their child that truth was negotiable if convenience demanded it. That night, Lila confronted Evan in the living room, not with accusations, but with facts, calmly stating that she knew he had not gone to Denver, that she was aware of Savannah, and that she had overheard his call. And the silence that followed was dense and revealing, because Evan did not deny any of it. Instead, exhaling slowly and sitting down as if relieved the performance could pause. And what followed was not a confession, but a justification. A carefully articulated narrative in which Evan framed his actions as necessary boundaries, explaining that he loved Lila, valued their family, but needed a separate space where he was not defined by responsibility, where he could exist without expectation. And when Lila asked, in the weeks following the mediated confrontation, Lila Hartwell began to rebuild a version of her life defined by clarity rather than curated appearances. A process that was both liberating and disorienting, because everything familiar routines, weekend rituals, even simple exchanges with Evan Cross-Reginal carried the weight of reconsideration, forcing her to navigate spaces once shared with unquestioned trust as arenas for negotiation and self-preservation. She devoted herself to Naomi Crossridge, emphasizing honesty, emotional awareness, and personal boundaries, creating an environment where their daughter could witness resilience rather than secrecy, and gradually introduced small, deliberate routines that reinforced autonomy. Shared dinners without Evan, weekend trips to museums and hiking trails, quiet evenings spent organizing family albums to reclaim her own narrative. And in doing so, Lila experienced a profound shift in perception, realizing that the life she had built was not defined solely by marriage, but by the choices she made within it. Evan, meanwhile, oscillated between detachment and attempts at influence, sending carefully worded messages, proposing family dinners, offering financial explanations, and inviting Naomi to trips framed as bonding. But Lila maintained control, responding with measured honesty and setting boundaries that Evan could not manipulate without acknowledgement. And in these interactions, she discovered a new sense of power, not from dominance, but from clarity and consistency. Professionally, Lila channeled the emotional intensity of recent events into her work, designing spaces that reflected transparency, openness, and trustworthiness. And clients often commented on a subtle warmth and authenticity in her style that felt unusually personal, as if her interior spaces mirrored the psychological transformations she was undergoing. And this creative focus served as both distraction and affirmation, allowing her to reclaim a sense of agency that had been overshadowed by years of curated marital performance. Social interactions also shifted. Friends who had admired the perfect couple now witnessed a woman asserting herself with quiet authority, attending events independently, speaking candidly about challenges without oversharing. And while some relationships strained under the change, others deepened, particularly those like Marie, who respected Lila's courage and reinforced her emerging confidence, offering both practical guidance and emotional grounding. The separation, formalized through legal channels, brought its own adjustments, requiring negotiations around shared assets, custody, and routines with Evan. And each step, though often frustrating, reinforced the reality that accountability is procedural as well as ethical, that transparency cannot be assumed, and that stability, rooted in ignorance, is no substitute for informed agency. And Lila approached these processes with methodical preparation, documenting conversations, financial transactions, and observed behaviors, thereby reclaiming the investigative mindset she had once applied passively within her marriage but now wielded proactively for her own protection. Over time, the emotional intensity began to normalize, not into complacency, but into a calibrated acceptance that relationships, even those once considered perfect, are complex, layered, and often contradictory, and that the role of observation, verification, and self-assertion is ongoing, because trust must be continually earned rather than presumed, and boundaries continually maintained rather than passively respected. On a personal level, Lila found moments of unexpected renewal: sunsets on the Westfield waterfront, laughter with Naomi over shared hobbies, quiet mornings spent journaling and reflecting, each experience reinforcing her autonomy and highlighting the resilience that had lain dormant beneath years of routine. And as she built this independent rhythm, she realized that the core revelation of the past months was not simply that Evan Crossridge had hidden aspects of his life, but that secrecy, once uncovered, becomes a catalyst for growth, forcing a reevaluation of identity, priorities, and moral agency. She also began to engage cautiously with the concept of forgiveness, understanding that forgiving Evan for his compartmentalization did not require reconciliation, but rather an acknowledgement of reality and an active decision to move forward without bitterness dominating her perspective. And in doing so, Lila discovered an inner equilibrium where empathy and self-preservation coexisted, allowing her to respond to Evan's continued attempts at influence with detachment rather than reaction. As the dust of confrontation settled, Lila started mentoring younger clients and friends facing relational challenges, sharing insights on the importance of boundaries, the risks of unexamined trust, and the power of observation and documentation, translating personal experience into guidance that emphasized both caution and empowerment. And in these interactions, she found meaning, purpose, and a renewed sense of identity beyond marital definition, realizing that the hidden life behind a perfect marriage, once exposed, could catalyze clarity, resilience, and self-reclamation in ways that perfection itself could never inspire. As our story draws to its final moments, Lila Hartwell's journey from quiet doubt to empowered clarity stands as a testament to the— And for those watching, it's important to remember that the cracks often appear where we least expect them, in small silences, subtle omissions, and patterns of secrecy that, if unexamined, calcify into long-term deception. And Deep Dive Secrets brings you these narratives not to sensationalize, but to illuminate the hidden dynamics that shape relationships and the consequences of unspoken truths. Lila's story concludes with a fragile equilibrium. She and Evan Crossridge maintain civility for Naomi Crossridge's sake, communicating when necessary and coordinating responsibilities. But the intimate trust that once defined their marriage has been replaced by carefully managed boundaries, accountability measures, and a recognition that secrecy, once exposed, cannot easily be reintegrated into love without honesty. And in this, there is both sadness and empowerment, because understanding the hidden architecture of deception allows those affected to reclaim agency and make deliberate choices rather than drift under illusion. Viewers should note that Lila's approached meticulous observation, documentation, strategic consultation with professionals, and deliberate emotional boundary settings, a framework applicable to any relationship where doubt arises, emphasizing that self-protection and maintaining ethical clarity are not acts of retaliation but necessary steps. toward psychological stability and family integrity. As you reflect on this narrative, consider the lessons about trust and transparency, the importance of asking questions when instincts signal discomfort, the power of verifying rather than assuming, and the strength found in preserving agency in the face of long-term manipulation. And while each marriage is unique, the themes revealed in Lila and Evan's story, compartmentalization, secrecy, rationalized deception, resonate widely, encouraging viewers to examine their own relationships with curiosity, courage, and mindfulness. Before we close, remember that Deep Dive Secrets is your resource for exploring these hidden narratives, uncovering subtle truths in the stories behind families, relationships, and human behavior. And if Lila's story has resonated with you, consider subscribing to the channel, turning on notifications, and joining our community. Because every week, we bring you in-depth explorations of secrets that shape lives, often unnoticed and often impactful. And by following, you gain access not only to stories like this, but also to insights, discussion, and resources for navigating complex relational landscapes. Finally, take a moment to reflect on what secrecy has taught us. Through Lila's journey, that uncovering hidden truths can be painful, disorienting, but ultimately liberating, and that reclaiming control of one's life, family, and moral compass is a deliberate process, one that begins with observation, moves through understanding, and solidifies with action. And by staying informed and engaged with stories like this, brought to you by Deep Dive Secrets, you equip yourself with the perspective and tools necessary to recognize when appearances are curated, when trust is compromised, and when the courage to act is required. So subscribe, engage, and prepare to explore the hidden layers behind every seemingly perfect life.